As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Lewis Hamilton says farewell to Mercedes after 12 amazing seasons in Abu Dhabi this weekend. But is he bowing out on a low? And what's the fallout from the latest round of FIA controversy? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer your questions on those topics and many more are Samarth Kanal and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Samarth, we'll come to you first. Welcome back. We're all here in Abu Dhabi. We haven't had you on for a few episodes, so how are you enjoying it?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the last F2 round of the season, where there's a 0.5 point gap between the top two and the last F1 race of the season. Lots of intrigue there. I want to give a quick shout out to the person who cut my hair in the Qatar paddock, Santos, I think his name is. I was completely lost on the people listening to the podcast, probably, but yeah.
Is this a spectacular haircut you're sporting right now?
Yes, absolutely. I wish everyone could see it right now. It looks wonderful. And yeah, it's just really great to be here. A bit warmer than Qatar, and I wonder what will happen this weekend.
Great positivity from Samarth there. Scott, how about you? Are you unnerved by the possibility that even though we're some floors up in the hotel, somebody might appear at the window, given there's some antics going on out there?
Yeah, there are some window cleaners doing their business on the outside of the hotel. Not literally.
That sounds counterproductive.
They appeared very briefly outside my window earlier while I was still working, which was very strange. I knew that they were sort of over my shoulder and just thought it was a bit weird. I'm more unnerved by the fact that you seem to have forgotten that Samarth was on the post-race podcast in Qatar, so you clearly didn't make much of an impression.
Oh, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, I wasn't in the same room then. So, it's funny. I sort of think of the post-race podcasts and all the other podcasts. They're in separate boxes in my mind. I don't know why, but
that's a lot of clutter in your mind. If they're all in separate boxes.
There's many boxes, much clutter. Some of it's in boxes, some of it isn't. But there we go. Well, we'll let you know if the people cleaning the windows pass by. That's not a job I envy. This is quite a tall building, so they're doing sterling work out there. There's also the possibility that my luggage might arrive during this podcast, so that's something to keep an eye on and be quite excited about. But hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions uninterrupted. So let's get into it. Scott, obviously Lewis Hamilton is having his Mercedes farewell. Quite a few questions about him. He was quite a big talking point over the Qatar weekend with some of what he said. So Kay Lois says, after all the punditry talk in Qatar, is Lewis Hamilton really losing his driving skills and abilities? Or does the car have a bigger part to play in his performances than what the pundits are saying? And Rana Menon asks if there is any evidence to say Hamilton is actually struggling with this generation of cars in general over one lap, or is it a Mercedes W15 issue?
So there's a few things to unpick from that. I obviously didn't listen to the specific pundit chat through the Qatar weekend as I was on site.
I was a bit worried you were going to say you didn't listen to the question and you were just going to make it up, but that's reassuring.
No, that's like my absolute worst case scenario emergency if I accidentally drift off without realising it. But I did listen to the question, and I will do my best to answer it in full. I am aware of the fact that Hamilton's post-qualifying comments in particular in Qatar triggered a lot of debate, and I imagine the discussion was along the lines of, so what does that mean? Has he lost it? Is he just... It's the sort of slightly maturer version of the, is Hamilton washed argument that you see on social media. So Hamilton, I think, sort of half clarified his comments on Sunday in the kind of cryptic way that he does when he's implying that there's something about the car that's holding him back, because he insisted that he has no doubts about himself, which means that the Saturday comment can only be inferred as meaning that he can't go faster in that car the way that it is. Now, that kind of links to the last part of the question about whether it's a 2024 Mercedes thing. I think it's a potentially Mercedes trait, and I think it's something that Ferrari are going to be, and Ferrari and Hamilton will be hoping will kind of resolve itself when he finally drives a different car next year. But so far it has kind of been a trait of this generation of ground effect era F1 cars. They behave differently, especially over one lap when everything is obviously a lot more extreme and on the edge. And I believe that is where Hamilton has struggled primarily, because race pace has tended to not be an issue. Race pace has been very strong, and there have been plenty of times where he has managed to overturn qualifying deficits or grid position deficits into very good results. Obviously, he has won a couple of races this year. So peak-wise, I don't think there's too much evidence that Hamilton is definitely not ever going to be quick again. And I think there is at least enough evidence to be cautiously optimistic that a change of scenery might unlock a bit more in him again. Where it becomes a concern is in that the behaviour of this car versus the previous generation of car means that you generate the lap time in corner entry and through corner in a slightly different way. The previous generation of cars, I think Hamilton was very much at one with in terms of getting rotation from the rear, I think, fairly early in the cornering phase. Whereas this generation of car is a lot harder, and I think when you attack the entry more in these cars, especially the Mercedes, I think you pick up a little bit more understeer, and then I think you're trying to force a rotation a little bit more. So we see Hamilton having more snaps mid corner, mid to exit. The curious thing about the Ferrari move is obviously whether or not that proves that this is a Mercedes trait that Hamilton's struggling to adapt to, because he's got the almost curse of the most experience of anyone on the grid, really, except for Fernando Alonso, and or whether or not it actually ends up being a bigger thing as part of these regulations, and therefore Ferrari will be much of the same.
Right, Samarth, we can go on to a question now for you from Steve D. It's rare for someone changing a job to be so openly downbeat about their abilities at any level. So to hear Lewis Hamilton say he's not fast is intriguing on the cusp of his move to Ferrari. It surprised many in the paddock, including Jenson Button in commentary. Do you think vocalising these thoughts is a bad idea, or is there an understandable or logical reason you can think for saying it?
Yeah, it's funny. I think he's just not happy, firstly. So that's why he's saying it. And he might be pointing to something, a lack of parity there or something. But it is a bit petulant. And I think it's not a good idea if you want to end on a high. I think it's just, to me, it seems like it is coming out that he's upset, but he's kind of wearing it on his shoulder. And I can't imagine it does much for team morale. And I can't imagine it's that good a look, really, for the team when they will want to end his career on a high. I know he's not getting the results, but at some point you've got to rein it in. He knows he's got a way out at the end of the season. He knows he's leaving. That there's light at the end of the tunnel. So why not just kind of downplay it a bit, keep it to yourself? That's what I think.
I guess he's always emotional and wears his heart on his sleeve, doesn't he? So it's honest, if nothing else. But I imagine he won't be speaking like that come next season. Question now I'll take from Daryl Finch. Why is the narrative around the Mercedes qualifying situation almost always framed as Lewis Hamilton having lost a few tenths and so rarely as George having stepped up his game? Is there data that explicitly shows that Russell's advantage this season is purely the result of Hamilton being a shadow of his former self on Saturdays and the occasional Friday? Is this explanation born out of the belief that Lewis Hamilton, as arguably F1's greatest ever qualifier, couldn't possibly be beaten like this if he hadn't lost his edge? Or does it come from the fact that his race pace has generally been as good as George's, suggesting the issue is more a one-lap thing? And does Russell ultimately deserve more credit for the job he's doing in qualifying? Russell does deserve a lot of credit. I think he's had a very, very good season. The car's been capricious and erratic, and he has got the most out of it. However, I think the reason it's framed as Lewis Hamilton having lost a few tenths is because the last 2 seasons, it's been nip and tuck between Russell and Hamilton in qualifying. They've had pretty even qualifying records, and that's impressive for Russell because of how good Hamilton is. So I think that doesn't need to be stated. It's just it's kind of a fact that Russell has been performing very well versus Hamilton, but it's because this year Lewis has been struggling more, and it's all relative. So you could argue that Russell's taken a big step forward, but Russell was getting a lot out of the car the past 2 years. So I think it's fair to say Hamilton is struggling over one lap, particularly in Q3 when you're putting it right on the edge and you make those mistakes.
I think it's also relative positioning, isn't it, compared to other teams? It's not like the Mercedes has suddenly dropped to becoming a Q3 marginal car and Russell's getting into Q3 every now and again, and Hamilton's the one that's struggling to make Q3 or being in the lower parts of the top 10 or something. And it's evident that Russell is still performing more or less where you'd expect Mercedes to be when they're apart. On their good days, they're slightly better, but they've never really been anything more than convincingly the sort of second, third, or fourth best team in this era, and they've kind of banded around that region. Whereas Hamilton's had days where he's been knocked out in Q2, and he's had those off days more than Russell. So I think that combined with what you were sort of getting at, Ed, which is that Russell hit the ground running early against Hamilton in qualifying. So he's always shown himself to be quick. Look at what he did when he got in the Mercedes when Hamilton was unwell and had COVID in the Sakir Grand Prix back in 2020. So Russell's pace is kind of established, and in that sort of weird way, it's gone 180, hasn't it? And now Russell's the benchmark. So that's where it flips, and you judge Hamilton falling away from him.
And we should note also that in races we're seeing, similar to what we've seen in the past, Hamilton's still good in races and Russell still doesn't quite have the tyre management. So there are times when Hamilton's stronger. And we should say, although Hamilton was complaining about race pace in Qatar, Russell was struggling on race pace as well. It's just that Russell was further forward, so it wasn't quite such a nightmare, whereas Hamilton was buried down the order. A question now from Alan Northcott, and this was obviously sent in on Sunday, but I think it's worth addressing. Should Mercedes sack Lewis Hamilton before next weekend? His constant negativity, childish antics, petulance and constant blame of others must be soul-destroying for his team.
Is that did Samarth submit that question under an alias? Because he described it as petulant.
I do go by Alan North. I am Alan North.
No, I don't fully agree with the characterization. So naturally, I would disagree that they need to part company. However, what I would say is that I think if there was no reason to continue with each other and kind of end things in the right way, I think an early split would have been better for both, because Hamilton has kind of made it clear he doesn't want to keep driving this car. He keeps saying that he just wants the season to end and he's looking forward to it. It doesn't sound like someone who is raring to go, because I almost have sympathy in a way, because you're kind of like, well, why would you, when everything is just not, it's all coming to a kind of pointless end. It's a total dead rubber for Hamilton and Mercedes. They're not fighting for anything. He's made it clear, probably because he knows he's going to get beaten, that he doesn't care about the Drivers' Championship in terms of him and Russell, who finishes ahead. So when you've got that side of things, plus the fact that Mercedes and Kimi Antonelli, Hamilton's successor, will gain a huge amount by having an early head start on 2025 and getting some races under his belt, there would be merit, just purely from a pragmatic point of view, of Hamilton being released from the kind of misery of this run-in that he doesn't want to be a part of anymore, and Antonelli getting an early head start and Mercedes being able to focus on that. But the contractual reality, commercial reality, and the fact that both sides do genuinely want to end this in the right way obviously precludes that from happening. And it is interesting because there are two separate things playing out before us where Hamilton and Mercedes are concerned, because you've got the 2024 season ending, which is obviously limp and miserable and becoming quite sour, and then you have the broader Hamilton-Mercedes era ending, which they want to celebrate.
I think it's going to be a celebratory weekend, this one, ultimately. But I think we can all have sympathy. I'm sure a lot of people have left jobs where things maybe aren't going quite well and you just want to get on with the next thing. Right, Samarth, now a question for you, which comes from a combination of Urban Strenchan, Andrew Dale and Long Live the King. All of them ask about Hamilton's Ferrari prospects for next year, particularly within the context of his qualifying struggles this year, and whether ultimately Charles Leclerc could beat him comfortably enough to maybe, as one of those three suggested, lead him to retire at the end of 2025.
Well, firstly, I believe he's on a multi-year contract, so it might be difficult to pull him out of that. And I don't think he's going to have any motivation to retire, especially jumping into Ferrari for 1 year would just seem like such a damp squib of a tenure at Ferrari. I'm sure he wants a lot more from that than just one season where he dips in and out. So no, I don't think he will retire at the end of 25. And I also don't think there's any guarantee that Leclerc will just get the better of him over the season. Maybe we'll see at the start of the season Leclerc will have a string of qualifying performances of Hamilton, but then we might see Hamilton come back. It really depends on how confident he is with the car, where his mindset is, and how much the car kind of evolves over the season. So no, I don't think he'll retire at the end of 2025.
And the final question for this section, I will take from Benjamin Tampin. Will Ferrari be worried that they're dropping Carlos Sainz, a driver who hasn't shown any signs of being slow, for Lewis Hamilton, who is openly admitting now he's not fast anymore? Yes, he's a legend, but if he is on a downward spiral, the credit he has will wear thin with the Tifosi quickly. Well, I wouldn't blame them if there's a little bit in the back of their mind, because I do like that Leclerc-Sainz lineup. I think it's very well balanced. I've said before, it is something they're sacrificing, however, because it's Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, they've gone that way. You can't really criticise them for that. But I think they will not be worried about Hamilton openly admitting he's not fast anymore. I don't think he really meant that in the literal sense. I think it was more a show of exasperation at how qualifying's been going, and I suspect the clean break will allow him to go into Ferrari, redouble his focus efforts, new environment, that can be very revitalising, so I think that'll be okay. What we'll see from him is very, very hard to tell. Hamilton's a brilliant driver. His ability hasn't gone overnight. His race pace is still good. At the absolute worst, I think Hamilton will be a very, very good Super Kimi Räikkönen in his second stint at Ferrari, if you want to look at it that way. As in, he'll be a very, very consistent second driver who'll do a good job. And I think he'll do that at a higher level anyway. That's the worst case scenario, I think. At the best case scenario, he's still Lewis Hamilton, isn't he? And he can do great things. So I would tend to think it'll be more towards the latter end. But I think if you're at Ferrari, if you're Fred Vasseur, he will defend publicly Hamilton to the hill. And I think he did say the other day, yeah, I'm not worried. There'll be a little bit in their mind thinking, well, I hope this works, because it's a big deal. Taking a megastar driver late in their career, ideally he'd have probably gone to Ferrari when he's a little bit younger, but they also won't underestimate what Lewis Hamilton can do. And I think they'll be focused on getting the most out of him. So if there is a bit in the back of their mind, I don't think it'll be a big worry. It's just a bit of let's just hope this does go well, as it should do. But I'd be focusing on that reset. I think Hamilton's focusing on that. Ferrari will get a revitalised Hamilton coming in. Your time and expertise are valuable. And with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. And best of all, Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites, allowing you to work smarter, not longer. For 15 years, Grammarly has helped professionals do more with their writing. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Disney Plus. Game on, because ESPN Plus content is available on Disney Plus. You can watch your favorites from Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus together like never before. With ESPN Plus, unwrap a full day of NBA action on Christmas Day. Tip off the festivities with the Spurs and Knicks, followed by the Mavs and Timberwolves. Then a clash between the Lakers and Warriors, followed by the 76ers and Celtics. And finally, the Nuggets face off against the Suns, all streaming December 25th. Then with Hulu, watch the terrifying sci-fi thriller Alien Romulus, where a group of young space colonizers come face to face with the ultimate horror. And on Disney Plus, follow the adventures of 4 kids across the galaxy as they meet unlikely allies and enemies in Star Wars: Skeleton Crew, starring Jude Law. All of these and more now streaming and available with a bundle subscription. Visit disneyplus.com for details. Terms apply.
Well, in part 2, we're going to address something we had a huge amount of questions about after the Qatar Grand Prix, which relates to the officiating, the FIA, etc. We tackled some of those in our race review episode. We had so many we couldn't get to. Apologies for that. We've read through all of them. We always read all the questions, and we will tackle as many as we can here now. The first from Ethan Fish, who says, with race control dropping the ball on that wing mirror on the track, which damaged 3 cars from 3 teams, is there a method by which the teams can charge damages to the FIA for mistakes like this? The answer to that specifically is no. The only cases where that's happened is things like Sainz hitting the inspection hatch cover in Las Vegas, the Haas hitting the drain cover in Malaysia a few years ago. That can lead to some restitution from the promoter, but that's a specific failing. And of course, the FIA disagrees with any accusations of dropping the ball. So, Scott, as we said last episode, we were waiting for an FIA explanation about what had gone on. We did get that on Monday morning. So, with that mirror incident specifically in mind, can you explain their position, please? And also tackle Lisa Stay-Fierce-Smith's question about how on earth it can be fair given the impact on the race.
Well, on that final point, just quickly, that question, fairness it's unfortunate, but fairness doesn't really come into it because the race just has to be managed in the best way possible. And if the FIA race control had handled this in the way that I think and a lot of people think was the most appropriate way, which is a full safety car, that would have been unfair to some competitors as well. Some people had already made their pit stop, so their rivals would have had a free pit stop. You have to freeze that, not, park that somewhere else in your mind, not think about it. Because otherwise you then get into the fact that you're making decisions that are influenced by the competitive order in the race, and you can inadvertently start messing with races the other way around. The justification for it, I think it effectively boils down to the FIA race control, the race director, Rui Marquez. It's his second F1 weekend, effectively getting caught between 2 slightly awkward positions, which is that they didn't feel a full safety car would be proportionate to the amount of debris that was on the track and needed to be dealt with, and the fact that a virtual safety car wasn't possible or wasn't sensible because the field spread was so big that if you only did a VSC, you wouldn't get a particularly long gap between cars, and then that would put a little bit of stress on the marshals. This is a relatively new race, and my understanding is that the experience among the marshals isn't as vast as it is at some other Grand Prix, so it would have been a needless stress. To my mind, that makes it even more appropriate to have done a full safety car. But the justification basically boils down to hoping the drivers would avoid it by warning the teams and letting them know exactly where the debris was and exactly where it was and what it was, and then that information being relayed to the drivers until such time as a better gap emerged to be able to then deploy a VSC and retrieve it that way. I don't think the plan ever was to just leave it there for the rest of the race under green flag conditions and just hope no one ever hit it for the entirety of the Grand Prix, but long enough to be able to deal with it properly. That is the kind of shortest version of the justification.
Yeah, I must admit, I'd have rather it was dealt with quicker. I think you don't need to be worried about a lot of those things, but at least that's something that's been explained. A safety car will always interfere positively and negatively with people's races. That's just the nature of the beast.
Look, ultimately, there's rationale for it, and I don't agree with it because I just think don't take any chances. Throw the safety car, deal with it, because the nature of the debris as well means that it would have then, as it did, become a much bigger issue if it does get hit. And with it being the only overtaking spot on the track, moving off lines very likely, whether overtaking or in defence, or as Bottas showed, hitting it while moving aside for faster cars. So I think it was a mistake, but mistakes are fine. That it is his second weekend doing this job. There's a lot going on, and I think I said this in a video we recorded earlier this week, is a good example of the fact that even the smallest things in a race that seem easy to handle on the surface can trip you up when you're trying to balance various considerations. I just wish the FIA had kind of held their hands up on that and just said, we recognise that there are different views on this. There does seem to be a bit of a swell of opinion that this could have been handled better. We'll review it, and that's that. But all they did was kind of justify the decisions that were made and then loosely said, we'll review this as we always do, and that kind of loses any meaning when it comes at the end of a statement that basically says everything we did was right.
Yeah, very true. The next question, Samarth, on this area of discussion. We had various questions. This is a bit of a combination, all about the Lando Norris drive-through penalty. Pat Thrice, Lewis Armstrong-Jones, Hayden Hodgson, Ben Harwood, Adam Barton and Dalton Reck all asked if the punishment was justified, whether it was mandated and if this was consistent with what we've seen before. Of course, this was the stop-go penalty, right? I think I may have said drive-through penalty, but it's a stop-go penalty, so over half a minute lost totally.
Yeah, I mean, it is mandated in terms of it's in the sporting regulations. It's Appendix H, Article 2.55b. Catchy title there. And, it's in the race director's event notes. Last time, so there is precedent, because the last time it happened was in Austria, where Nicholas Latifi and Nikita Mazepin both got the penalty 10-second stop and go, except theirs was added on as like a time penalty at the end of those race events. Which is
because there wasn't time to serve it. That's in lieu of the penalty happening.
So there is precedent there. One could argue that it does actually seem harsh. We don't see too many stop-and-go penalties anymore, really. There's only been one other one this year, and that was in Emilia-Romagna in Imola, and that was for Alexander Albon for an unsafe release. So, we don't see them, and I think the FIA really hands them out when it feels like it's an actual safety breach. So it is trying to look for safety, and I do sympathise with them on that one. You do have to keep, you have to keep on the ball for safety reasons. So fair enough.
Yeah, and it's in the guidelines. They're not the public guidelines, but they're the ones they have for this year. So it's in keeping with that. The next question I'll take from Juan Arevalo. How much influence does the race director have over the penalties issued by the stewards? Simple answer on that, none. They will be involved in the broader discussions that happen that might lead to guidelines, but the steward's job in the race is not to influence the guideline, not to influence the penalty given. And that's the same with everyone else in the FIA. You appoint the stewards, they are the referees, they take the decision. They can consider everything that's been said around it, but the race director can't say that's a stop-go. Nobody else in the FIA can say that's a disqualification, that's a 5-second penalty. That is not how it works, and that's a really important factor. So race director and the stewards, two very, very different functions. Scott, a question from David Tripler. I'm sure there will be lots of questions about the shambolic officiating in Qatar. To me, these issues seem systemic at this point because they seem to happen independently of specific people, with different race directors and stewards running into the same problems. So what do you think are the structural changes that could help improve things for the future, both in terms of the rules and the setup of the decision-making institutions?
Well, I think for starters, we were heading in the right direction with a single race director. After Michael Massey's exit, there was that plan for Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the FIA president, to bring in multiple race directors and basically have them rotating.
How's that going?
Yeah, well, I mean, he has effectively, now started to instigate it, hasn't he? Because he switched the race directors. But I never thought that was
I'm not sure that was quite the aim.
No. The thing is, he vastly underestimates how difficult certain jobs are within the FIA and especially around the running of Formula One. That much is clear. The justification around why it wasn't a big deal for Marquez to be doing F1 and F2 duties on the same weekend when he was only just in the F1 job is proof of that.
You say he underestimates it, Scott, but need I remind you, he is a driver.
He is, yeah, and he respects the drivers.
I'm not sure if he's mentioned that, but he is.
He is, yeah, exactly. It never goes down particularly well within the paddock when he mentions that, because it just feels very dismissive, and it's a bit disingenuous, and it's also just showing a lack of respect. It's almost like putting himself in the same bracket as those competitors, and he is not.
He's an accomplished rally driver,
14-time Middle East rally champion, I think. So yeah, there's success in that specific field. That's fine, but whatever. Anyway, the reason for the single race director is that it builds experience, it builds an understanding of incredibly complex processes and regulations on the sporting side that is, of course, supported by other people in the room and back in Geneva in the remote operations centre and all of this. But the race director themselves needs to have a great understanding of what's going on. That can only be built up over time. In the same vein, that's how you build up a rapport with the drivers. That's how you build up the kind of knowledge base and experience within the paddock, and all of these things that basically come together to make the race director as informed and knowledgeable as possible. So that's the first thing, that we need to ring fence and enshrine the race director position rather than treat it like it doesn't really matter who is there and it's like it's a job that anyone can do, parachuted in at the last minute. I would also say, which is not a new position for us on this podcast, we need to have permanent stewards. I don't think it necessarily needs to be exactly the same 3 or 4 stewards at every single Grand Prix, but I'd like to see a smaller pool. I'd like them to be professional. That's not a criticism of their conduct at the moment or their capabilities or anything like that. It is just from a paid professional full-time job point of view, they are not professionals. They
like every other top line big time sport.
Yes,
professional
exactly.
refs.
It's a voluntary position. So I would change that, because I think when you've got the same drivers race in, race out, and you've got different circuits, different scenarios, blah, blah, blah. I think you need to minimize the variables as much as possible. And when we're trying to get to the bottom of what's the best way to set racing rules going forward, and my personal view on that is to have everybody have a broad understanding of the things you're trying to achieve and then have as few rules as possible. I think a smaller set of stewards would help achieve that, because you'd have a bit more consistency in understanding of the application of the rules. And that's critical, because you see, for example, referees, officials in football have different interpretations of what is considered too much aggression in a tackle, and a different referee will give a booking for a tackle in football compared to another referee that might let it go, or another referee that might give a straight red card for it. We don't want that much variation in Formula One, where one set of stewards one weekend will judge an incident to be completely okay, and then it might not be an absolute like for like, because that never really happens. Every corner and situation and race wheel to wheel battle is different. Might interpret a fundamentally similar fight in a different way. And that makes it really hard for the drivers to know what they can do in battle. And it makes it harder for fans to understand what's going on when they're watching it and why decisions have been made.
Coming back to you, Samarth, Mike Mason, Ben Kay, Stephen Camp, Lancelot and Mr. Wapajif all asked questions about FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem and whether his actions in terms of removing race directors and his general treatment of F1 means he could be ousted or removed.
Well, I think so. There's an election every 4 years. He was elected in December 2021. Yes. I believe so.
Just after the incident that's
the incident
immediately caused a controversy.
Let's not talk about that one then. I think it would take a power struggle basically to oust him, and I think people would need to take sides and then kind of take some executive action if they would take that. I don't know if there's a provision really for the FIA to do it, but as with any organization, if that happens, it's quite catastrophic. You find people taking sides and losing their job or losing friends and stuff, so I doubt anyone's really going to want to take that action. So I think they're just going to leave it for the election, to be honest. I think and it wouldn't be a good look for the FIA anyway, really. They wouldn't want that either. So I think we're just gonna see what happens at the next election in 2025.
Well, I was going to say the first thing is he needs an opponent. Right now, I think he's going to be running for the presidency unopposed, so he'll be re-elected for a second term.
Yeah, and it should be noted, F1 itself has no influence upon that. Well, no direct influence. Who knows behind the scenes or whatever, but it's important to remember, and I have said this before, but motorsport is only part of what the FIA does. Actually, it's a minority part. Mobility is a big chunk of it. It's about 2/3, 1/3, something of that issue. So that's important to remember. Question now from Mark Martin, presumably not the NASCAR legend. There seems to be a pattern of bizarre penalties being applied whenever Derek Warwick is a steward. Is this a concern for the teams and drivers at all? Well, I'm not sure I'd agree there's bizarre penalties when Derek Warwick is a steward. He was one of the stewards for Abu Dhabi in 2021, which was an unusual situation. But I think generally, and obviously I know Derek Warwick, I did an interview with him for our members feed not so long ago, which we did talk about stewarding actually, which is worth a bit of a listen. But my experience of Derek is he's always actually very fastidious and detail oriented and takes it very, very seriously. I don't think that. And also, he's only one of a pool of stewards. The driver steward, the high-profile driver steward, doesn't take the decisions. They're just one member of the panel.
I would also point out that it's kind of the criticism of someone like Derek basically comes down to whether or not he's involved in the decision that goes against your driver or is perceived to have gone against your driver or not, because just as well as people are criticising the decision, and presumably they're criticising Warwick for being involved in some way in the one place penalty for Max Verstappen, for example, at the Qatar Grand Prix, after the qualifying incident in inverted commas, because it wasn't much of an incident with George Russell. On another weekend, you see accusations that Derek is massively biased in favour of Verstappen and Red Bull because of the fact he owns a Honda dealership in Jersey, and therefore any success for Red Bull and Verstappen, because it's got a Honda-powered engine, it's a conflict of interest because it massively directly influences his business, which, as far as I'm aware, literally nobody in F1 has any problem with, because they know that it's absolutely a non-issue. But that's my point, is like that it depends where the decision goes, right? Like, people will always find a way to have proof of an agenda against who it is that they support.
Yeah, very much so. And the driver steward always has the attention on them because they're the people that everyone on the outside knows. The other stewards will, for the most part, not be names that people recognise. So all of these perceived things aren't seen. Any driver will have a history of connections with all sorts of people. And again, I agree with you. I've never heard anyone in the paddock raising concerns about it. And I have a high opinion of Derek Warwick personally. And I know, obviously, you've dealt with Derek a lot over the years, Scott, and you have the same. In terms of that pattern of bizarre penalties, I haven't seen it. I would say if anyone wants to go through and highlight what they think is a pattern of penalty problems, I'll be very, very happy to look at it. But it's always important to remember there's a lot of detail behind these and guidelines, some of which aren't public, in fairness, so it's hard for fans to know. But the consistency in terms of the penalties isn't perhaps as erratic as you might think, because it is often there in black and white.
I would also point out, just very quickly, and this isn't a Warwick-specific point, but most of the stewards that I've spoken to or know of as people and their reputations, they are absolutely not the kind of people that enjoy handing out penalties. They don't want to hand out penalties. They'd actually quite like to let a lot of racing happen. They'd like to shrug things off. But unfortunately, with the way that things have gone, with the calls for consistency, with the calls for certain things to be punished and this, that and the other, we've ended up in a situation where more often than not, the stewards are almost obliged to hand out a penalty that they might not actually agree with individually, but based on the rule book and applying the rules as written and as intended, has to result in some kind of punishment.
Exactly. A classic example is the Vettel penalty in Canada a few years ago when he did the unsafe rejoin. Stewards would have quite liked to let that go, but they couldn't because of what the rules said. That's what you apply. Any other sport, you're a football referee, you apply the rules and the guidelines you've got. You don't say, do you know what? I don't think a handball in the box should be a penalty or deliberate handball. You apply it. Well, and everything's judgment beyond that.
That's really important, because there is discretion for the stewards to apply, but that discretion doesn't just mean ignore an offence. That means, okay, taking into as many factors as possible and then coming to the best possible conclusion within that. But quite often that has to be, this has to be a penalty. Can we mitigate it? That tends to be the way that they can apply discretion.
And in my experience, certainly the driver stewards, who are often the ones that we know best, the people who've done it, they take a very, very serious approach. Not just Derek Warwick, Tonio Liuzzi, Enrique Bernaldi, Tom Christensen's done it in the past, Alan Manish. Loads of very, very high quality, very, very serious people are doing this. And they know people are looking. They know that their judgments could be held to a legal standard.
Sorry, I know that we're turning this into a two-person stewarding podcast just for Samarth's benefit while he sits there in absolute awe of what we're saying. I don't think he'd ever do it. I'd love Jolyon Palmer to have a go at being a steward, because I think that would be a fresh, different, younger perspective as well, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I really, really like the experience that has been built up amongst many of the racing driver stewards and other stewards, but I do think that would be a fascinating perspective, and I do think he's got the right kind of modern racing driver eye for things, and tended actually to, one way or another, like agree with a lot of his sort of views on some of the more controversial incidents we've seen over the last few years. So I mean, I'll mention it to him if I see him in Abu Dhabi this weekend. He was in Qatar. I should have maybe mentioned it to him there. He probably wouldn't appreciate me volunteering him for FIA duty, but I'd like him to suck it up and give it a go.
Yeah, I think he's got more of an interest in appearing on Celebrity Pointless or Celebrity MasterChef, actually, from last time I heard. So I'm just going to put him on the spot with that one. But yeah,
people who go on Pointless.
You know what? That is a great show. Has anyone been on Pointless here?
I mean, I haven't been on Pointless. Have you been on Pointless, Ed?
There are three of us on this podcast who have never successfully won the final in Pointless. One of us on this podcast has made the final on podcast.
That means I've got the trophy.
You have got the Pointless trophy. Yeah. For those who aren't in the UK or don't watch it, it's a very popular quiz show in
televised game show that Samarth was a pretty successful participant on.
I think I was all right.
In case we're not being clear enough.
Think of it as you lead the race from start to finish, and then you make a rather rudimentary error on the last lap.
What tripped you up, for the benefit of me who can't remember this story, and also the podcast listeners who are clearly massively interested?
Yeah, they're leaning in now. It was the authors in the Penguin Little Black Books collection.
Okay.
So there you go.
Which wasn't what you chose, a vague final category, and it was that.
Yeah, I blame my brother for that.
That's fair. You've always got to have someone to blame. Anyway, we have gone massively off piste there, yes. But I felt I couldn't resist that. I always like to.
Maybe there's a segue coming up. Speaking of Pointless, let's talk about Sauber, because they're not anymore. Is that the next question, Ed?
Do you know what? I'll give it a go. Speaking of Pointless, here's a question for you, Scott.
Very good. Well done. That.
The question itself is not pointless. It comes from Nick Wolf. Do we feel like the race direction and Mohammed Ben Sulayem's latest interview is the FIA hitting rock bottom, or is there some newer depth to which they can take themselves?
Well, it is concerning, and there are elements of it that do worry me and I wish were just constantly being handled better. The element at the moment that concerns me more is I don't know if people have read this, listen to the podcast when it comes out, but if you haven't, go on the BBC Sport website and the Formula One page and seek it out. It's a story by Andrew Benson. Obviously, the very experienced, very good journalist has written a story about potential changes to the FIA statutes that would, the short version, be limit the power and authority of the committees and individuals that basically police or vet FIA matters when it comes to like financial matters and ethics. It would put an extra degree of protection effectively between the FIA president and the FIA Senate president, the leader of the Senate, from external scrutiny, third-party scrutiny, because it's complicated, because it's a very good story from Andrew, and my understanding is the way that he's characterised it is completely correct. I haven't seen the exact wording of the proposed changes, so it's a little bit difficult for me to speak in precise terms. If it is as I understand it to be, that would potentially be more alarming. There's a vote that will go to the FIA assembly next week as we record this. If it gets approved, it will basically mean slightly watered down powers of accountability, effectively, for people within the FIA, including the president. And in a year in which there have been two dismissed, it must be said, acts that were investigated after the compliance officer did a report earlier in the year, plus some other question marks that have arisen about use of funds, or I think it's $1.5 million members fund, for example, for members that ultimately do vote for the president, and how appropriate that is or isn't. It is slightly alarming. So that is on my radar at the moment as something that would worry me more. But I need to learn more about it myself, and I need to speak to some other people who have better understanding of how it works at the moment and how this would change it. But again, go and read Andrew's story if you haven't already.
Yeah, well worth doing. It's important that the FIA is a strong regulator for Formula One. I do think that's essential. Whether or not this is the right pathway to achieve that is another question. Samarth, the question from Gareth Anstey. How much risk is the race director under of being fired by Ben Sulayem if they call out a safety car? So that refers to the mirror lack of safety car we discussed earlier. Joe Graham also asked if there was a need to sack another race director.
That's an interesting question. How much risk is the race director under? Well, before, let's say, a few months ago, I would have said zero to this question, but now anything goes, really. I mean, I think the race director could be dismissed. I mean, there's precedent now, really, that we're seeing, which is a bit of a shame. I don't think that them calling out a safety car would be the reason for that, though. I don't think the powers above at the FIA have that much scrutiny as to what goes into a race. But, I don't know. I'm not there behind the scenes, of course. It would be pretty weird if that happened again as well, if we saw another race director dismissed this season. And I don't think there's no need for it, really. I didn't think there was any need in the first place. And I don't think something as trivial as bringing out a safety car would really trigger that. Yeah,
and I think the idea of just constantly sacking race directors because you don't like decisions, it's a very slippery slope. This is football managerification of the whole thing, which is absurd. These people become race directors because they are very, very accomplished, and they should be backed and put in the environment where they can direct the race and not be worried about all these tangential things. And that's, I think, very important to see. They shouldn't be worried about their position. Yes, consistent failure, shortcomings, lack of professionalism or whatever should all lead to potentially people's positions being in jeopardy. But the idea that just disagreeing with decisions or things just being unlucky and going against you should just lead to this constant thing of, another race director, and it's just nonsensical. And Rui Marquez is very, very capable and absolutely shouldn't have to be worried about that. He should be empowered to do his job and direct the race safely, properly, correctly, and that's what he's absolutely capable of doing. The final question in this section from Alan North: should drivers contemplate going on strike until the FIA race directors and presidents sort themselves out? Today has shown how out of touch the president is and how inconsistent race control is. The Norris penalty was ludicrous. This is ruining the racing. Well, you may not like the Norris penalty. It was in line with guidelines. Whether the guidelines should change, another matter. It's always an option. However, I would say it's quite a long way from the drivers going on strike. However, the drivers are quite unimpressed with the treatment they're getting. So let's just say it is always an option. It has happened before. Go back 40 odd years.
And I don't think the comments that Ben Sulayem made in that interview that appeared on the Sunday in Qatar went down very well with at least a couple of drivers from what I heard. But obviously that emerged on the Sunday in Qatar, and I think it will be Thursday in Abu Dhabi where we hear from a few drivers, especially George Russell, obviously a GPDA director who has been among the most outspoken about this, what they really think about that. Being told basically to mind your business, even when you've made it very, very clear you're unhappy with what's going on, is not the way for this to be a kind of constructive relationship. Ben Sulayem is not he's not the driver's he's not the driver's puppet. He doesn't answer to them or anything like that. But it's a monumental error to just go to war against them, because that's what he's done with that interview. He has basically invited a needless confrontation and a fight. Basically, he's calling their bluff. And it might not necessarily be a strike as you've just gone into there, Ed, but there might well be a reaction from the drivers coming.
Exactly. And if this keeps happening, there continues to be escalation, then who knows where it may lead.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Craven the hunter, who uses all the methods of the animals.
On December 13th.
Once you're on his list, there's only one way off.
Are you like your father?
He puts evil into the world. I get rid of people like him.
Who's next?
Witness the making of a new Marvel villain.
You think you're some kind of honor. You're a criminal, just like our father.
Aaron Taylor Johnson is Craven the Hunter. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent. In theaters December 13th.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Let's move on to our final part now. A mixed bag of questions after the first two theme sections. Scott, a question from Matthew McMahon. Is it a case now of who is in contention for the second Red Bull seat as opposed to will Perez save his seat?
Yeah, it's a matter of how Perez leaves Red Bull, I believe, and who replaces him rather than if he does. The plan, as we sit here right now, is for Red Bull to replace Perez at after the season finale. It won't be officially decided until after the season finale because there'll be a meeting of the Red Bull stakeholders and on maybe the day after, maybe on Monday, but it might be later in the week. I can't remember. My brain's going blank as I speak. But the priority there will effectively be how to manage it, because I think Perez is basically being given the choice. It's do you can leave, quote, on your own terms effectively by retiring, and therefore you kind of leave with a little bit more dignity than being sacked, and there's probably some kind of amicable arrangement that can be come to there in terms of compensation, a future Red Bull role, whatever. Or you can stand your ground, fight for the compensation that you believe, or just hold them to, I've got a contract, you have to keep me for next year, force Red Bull's hand, they sack him, and then obviously it looks worse on him, and maybe there's a little bit more of an acrimonious exit. So let's see how that plays out. But right now, Liam Lawson is the leading contender to replace Perez. The problem for Yuki Tsunoda, I don't want to say the problem with Yuki Tsunoda, but the problem for Yuki is that Red Bull has doubts about other aspects of his all-round offering rather than just his speed, because they know he's very quick. And it's ironic in a way that Yuki's so quick that's why actually they're quite pleased with Lawson, because they know that Yuki's so fast, so they think that Lawson occasionally out-qualifying him and beating him actually means that for someone so inexperienced in Formula 1, Lawson's doing a really good job. But they think Lawson's more mentally robust. They think Lawson will be able to cope with the challenge of being Verstappen's teammate better than Yuki would. I think they fear that Tsunoda would either be sent into a spiral against him or would make mistakes and lose some emotional control or something along those lines. I think there's also worth considering the element of Tsunoda is primarily a Honda driver. He's been a Red Bull Junior for several years, but he was on the Honda program before that. Honda, I think, have made a financial contribution to not only him getting into F1, but then staying in F1. I think that changed for this year. But he is ultimately sort of Honda's man in the team. And he's never really been treated like, or seems like, a proper Red Bull Junior, like one of their own. It always feels like a sort of Red Bull Junior by association almost. And with Honda leaving, obviously, to join Aston Martin for 2026, there may be a feeling of, well, it might make Honda happy, but if they're the main people who believe in him and they're leaving after 1 year anyway, why would we put him in for 1 year? So yeah, it just doesn't look great for Tsunoda at the moment. Should state that any of that could change over the next few days when the reality of things like commercial considerations and other stuff, one final performance from everybody. It's been very, very volatile, the whole situation, for several months. But this feels a lot more concrete than it did before the summer break, when it was looking like they might drop Perez in season. Now it feels a bit more definitive. Well, no, it feels a lot more definitive than that.
Samarth, on a related note from Dan Neal, stunningly, the more I watch Liam Lawson race, the less I think he should be in the Red Bull next season. I don't think he's shown the speed or the racecraft to warrant a promotion this year. Saying this, Perez should categorically not be in that seat next year, I'm sure of that. How have Red Bull managed to mess up their driver lineup so badly? And connected to that, Voyager 15 asks if there is any paddock talk of Lawson's tendency to create fights on track in all sorts of situations, risking his Red Bull chances.
So I think part of that question is about how Red Bull's set up, where you kind of have to appease both sides there. You've got to appease the Horner camp, you've got to appease the Marco camp. So in terms of that, I mean, Red Bull put a lot of pressure on their drivers, and they make no secret about it. It's a very hard place to be. And what I think they've done really is created a situation where drivers come in, they get a very, very short stay. We've seen that with Gasly, Albon. We've seen it with Ricciardo. I mean, Ricciardo had a bit more of a chance as well, but we see it with drivers where they're not afraid to make changes. And I think a similar thing might happen to Lawson. It does beg the question as to whether they've prioritized having Verstappen so much, they've not really paid attention to having the second driver who can kind of pull the weight as much as Verstappen does. Maybe it's a question of adaptability. Maybe it's a question of making wrong decisions during the whole junior driver lineup thing, so actually not training them up well enough, or making the wrong decisions on who to keep and who to kind of nurture. It's an incredibly tough place, so obviously I sympathise with the drivers who go through it, and I kind of sympathise with the people making the decisions at Red Bull. I don't think it's an easy one, but it's a bit harsh to say they've messed it up. But yeah,
is it?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe not. I mean, that's such a negative connotation, but it's true. Red Bull does have a second driver problem here, and it's only Verstappen that consistently delivers for them. So that is the big problem. I don't know if I go as far as say messed it up. Do you think they messed it up, Ed?
I think they have. They've got everything they need. They've got 4 seats in F1 uniquely. They're a very desirable destination. They've got a top team, and they've got the budget. They should be comfortably they should be the best young driver development program in town, and they should have a very, very clear conveyor belt. They shouldn't have, as they have had for multiple years now, a scenario where they're not convinced with some of the drivers they've got on their second team, where they are in 2 cases, Danny Kvyat and Alex Albon and Brendan Hartley, actually 3 cases, re-signing people that they dropped previously because that shows something's got wrong, and it should just work more smoothly. They've done the really hard bit, which is having the megastar. They've always had, Vettel, Ricciardo, Verstappen is a great trio of team leaders. But the second driver has been a problem ever since Daniel Ricciardo left. They've never successfully solved that. And it feels like they're just hitting and hoping. The options for next year, I don't think any of them are going to be the definitive answer.
No, I suspect not either. But do you think this is a problem of having decision by committee? Do you think that there's not a centralised person making these decisions and you're always playing both sides here?
Well, Helmut Marko is the one who's got control of the programme. I wonder if the way you talent, scout and develop drivers has moved on a bit. He's had a lot of success. He is very, very sharp at picking up young talent, or has been, but it feels a little bit more scattergun for the modern world, I think. Personally, I think things have moved on, and now it's almost like football scouting, where knowledge is power. You are paying very, very close attention from a very, very young age and factoring in all sorts of things to pick out those drivers, not just grabbing people who catch your attention. I just think the game's moved on.
I also think the competition has sort of caught up as well. With that whole Red Bull Junior Academy, we're seeing Williams have fielded Colapinto. We're seeing Mercedes with Antonelli. I mean, we can go back. We can go younger a bit. McLaren have got Ugo Chokwu and, of course, Bortoletto, at least for a couple of months. So, yeah, maybe Red Bull's been left behind while other teams have kind of evolved their game. What was the second part of that question? Lawson's tendency to create fights on track. Well, I think as Scott Mitchell-Malm wrote after Mexico, Red Bull did slightly look down upon Lawson's Mexico City thing, but not too much. They didn't see it as a massive issue.
Yeah, it wasn't criticised in the way that you might expect Red Bull to criticise a young driver screwing with one of their main cars, unless they like that young driver more than they perhaps support the driver in their main car.
The next question I'll take from Chris Atkins. Where does Franco Colapinto's career stand after his early performances have faded away? Is this another Logan Sargent trajectory or just a rookie being initiated to F1? Yeah, I think it is a rookie being initiated to F1, one who hasn't had lots of preparation and testing. And his high points have been really good. So I think still a good impression despite the crashes. Currently, he is Williams' third driver for next year. He will do TPC running. And he will be in an interesting position. If Williams need a driver or if someone else needs a race driver, he will be an obvious choice. The Red Bull interest has very much faded. Never know, could come back. You never know with Red Bull. There was Alpine interest. That seems to have cooled, but still seems to be alive. So we'll see what happens there. I suspect most likely he is going to be on the sidelines next year in that Williams role, but he's still built up some credit this year. I think anybody who looks at a driver who's been thrown in mid-season without a great deal of F1 mileage and done what he's done, you have to look at the peaks, and they've been very impressive. So he's still got credit in the bank, and I would be, even if he's not on the grid for the start of next year, I'd be very surprised if he doesn't return to an F1 grid in the future. Scott, a question from Ben Jarrett. The Qatar Grand Prix seemed more of a reason to give points to more finishers because the idea that Valtteri Bottas's race deserved the same 0 points as Lewis Hamilton's disaster class confuses me. I don't really understand why you can beat someone on track and get the same nothing afterwards. Is there any likelihood of expanding points-paying positions wider than the current 10?
There was obviously the discussion earlier this year around it. First, I think it started out as maybe expanding it to the top 12. But while that was sort of cautiously met with some agreement, it was thought that if we're going to make a change, do we need to make one that we think will sort of stand the test of a bit more time rather than find ourselves in the same position 3 years down the line and asking, oh, well, do we need to expand it to the top 15 or points for all cars? So this was part of the discussion, and there just wasn't a consensus really on how best to do it. I've made it no secret at several times, especially when this was a talking point earlier this year. I'd like to see it expanded. I wouldn't want to see points for all cars, I don't think, but maybe points for all finishers, or certainly points for the top 12. And I think the way that the P6 fight in the championship this year looks like it might play out is the reason why, because I'm really, really impressed by the turnaround Alpine's done, because while you might not have the points to show for it without that Brazil result, it's a bit like Aston Martin in 2022. The final championship position doesn't actually reflect the trajectory that a team's been on. And to go from last in such a miserable place in Bahrain with the slowest car, heavy car, not working properly, to a car that is currently like just such a top 10 car on merit. Pierre Gasly's doing one of them is anyway. Pierre Gasly's doing a great job for Alpine, and obviously they had that double podium in Brazil, but they haven't been the 6th best team this year. Haas has been the 6th best team, and if it was done purely on, if you did it on average results or you did it on the top 12 points, I'm sure Haas would come out ahead of Alpine. So this is just a good example. I think it will be a case study anyway of how a small change to the points distribution would actually better reflect the championship.
Samarth, question from Ryan Norrie. If drivers want to retire the car, a la Hamilton in Qatar, why do teams push back? Is it to collect further data for the car, or the principle of if the car can finish, you finish?
Yeah, definitely. Hamilton's not the only driver to have expressed that when feeling a bit demoralised about the car's pace and his position in the race. I think teams push back because F1's full of people who really don't want to give up, firstly. Secondly, there's always an opportunity to score if there's a late safety car. And even, you can hamper your rivals in some way. We've got that fastest lap point for the top 10. So why retire the car if you can, take a point off someone else or slow someone down, or and then there's data. You can always collect data in different situations. I think at the end of the season, there's probably less of that. So you might see other people retiring the car a bit more in the end of the season. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to gain from staying out there and plugging away at it, especially. I mean, I think the safety car is probably the biggest thing there.
I think in Hamilton's case, didn't he also have a time penalty to serve? So, and if you retire and you haven't served that penalty, I think it turns into a grid position penalty for the next Grand Prix. Because if you remember earlier this year, I think it was this year, it might have been last year, but I think it was this year. Remember Red Bull unretired Sergio Perez? What race was that?
I can't remember the race, but we saw Lance Stroll do it as well in Qatar.
Yeah, if you've got a time penalty to serve, you have to do it. And I'm pretty sure again, mine going blank on me at a crucial moment, but I'm pretty sure Hamilton hadn't served a time penalty or a drive-through or something like that in the Qatar Grand Prix at the time in which he wanted to retire. Because I'm sure he got a message from Bono saying, you can, but then you'll have a grid drop next week, because he hadn't served the penalty.
But then what stops you from serving the penalty and then retiring?
Oh, you can do that, but then the reasons that you pointed out come into play. So at the time, it was very much I think they did that as a little bit of this is get you out of the mindset that you're in, Lewis.
Yeah.
Just FYI, you'll have a grid pen. So he parks it and carries on. Whereas, yes, we've seen on other occasions, like the ones we've just talked about there, where they do then just go, there is no point in continuing from the position that we're in, but we'll go out, normally, serve the penalty in the most pointless way. I think that is something that needs to change, to be honest. And then, you don't have a penalty for the next Grand Prix.
And I remember Spain 2022 when Hamilton had that clash with Magnussen early on, said, should we retire the car to save it? And of course, he had a mega drive, came through to fifth, I think, at the end. So, you never know what happens. And drivers, often it's an emotional reaction, isn't it? And they sometimes feel, well, maybe we save the engine, save this, that, and the other. Or they just want to get out of there. But it's always worth plugging on. You never know what will happen. Question I'll take from Matt Marvell. Surely with both Ocon and Hamilton, their teams would begin withholding information about procedures and any new developments to prevent them from taking away more knowledge than strictly necessary to their future teams. Could this restriction be contributing to a loss of lap time? Yeah, they'll be walled off from 25 stuff. Their feedback will still be taken on board and will feed into it. And obviously the centre of gravity moves to the driver who will be there the following year. That's just the way these things work. I don't think it'll have an impact on the current lap time, maybe a little bit if the other driver's being favoured, but this often gets overstated, I think. They'll still be actively engaged with Ocon, not anymore because he's not going to be in the car in Abu Dhabi, but I don't think it'd make a huge difference to current performance. And also the driver's input on the next year's car, it's there, but there's only so much they can do. They can give feedback, say what they want, but they don't design the car, ultimately. And Hamilton won't have driven the Merc, I imagine, in the simulator for next year. Certainly not for a very, very long time, whatever. But he doesn't do a vast amount of simulator work anyway. So I don't think it's a big problem for either of those two. I think maybe the emotional impact is a little bit bigger and feeling like you're not quite so involved. But yes, it's not a big thing and doesn't lose you lap time. Scott Tosin Alojo says, what is the actual point of having Ocon be out of Alpine in the last race for Jack Doohan? And related to that from Thomas Knight, how impressive has Pierre Gasly been in the second half of the season? And how tough will it be for Doohan to go up against him next season?
Well, I think keeping him was achieving nothing in terms of the aid in the championship fight. It was just souring thing for both parties. A little bit like I was sort of talking about with Hamilton and Mercedes earlier. Ocon was really unhappy with the position that he was in. And Alpine were, I think, growing frustrated with some of the comments that he was making, hinting at there being some kind of performance discrepancy between the cars or whatever. So with Jack Doohan coming in next year, it made sense to get a head start on his preparations and a chance for Alpine to evaluate Doohan in the most representative environment possible. They've done a lot of TPC stuff for him. I think Pierre Gasly joined very briefly to do a set of reference time when he tested in Qatar not that long ago. But there have been these sort of suggestions that Alpine, Flavio Briatore in particular, was looking at maybe Doohan not being the best option for them and wanting to evaluate him and potentially replace him with Franco Colapinto, for example. So getting him in the car before the end of the season and having that representative comparison to not just Gasly, but also like how other rookies have done this year when they've stepped in, and how other drivers on the grid perform that weekend, just gives Alpine that little bit of extra knowledge if they do want to do something ruthless with Doohan, which I don't think is imminent, but it will just add to the sort of pile that they have. I do think Doohan's got a tough task up against Gasly. I'd have thought that regardless of who kind of stepped in, because Gasly at his best is very good. How good he would be if he got back into a top team is hard to say. But the form that he's been on in the second half of this year, I think, in particular, has been peak Gasly, where he's like making things happen for himself. He's performing really well, qualifying really strongly, and when he's got into very strong positions, he's damn well made the most of them. So with his experience and his confidence and his place in the team as well, having shoved Ocon out the door effectively and made himself very much Alpine's number one, Doohan will have it tough, but he's well prepared. He's got the right attitude, so it'll be interesting to see how he copes with it. Starting with this weekend, obviously. Yeah,
it'll be an interesting storyline for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix weekend. Thanks to Scott and Samarth. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. If you want to join the question asking fun, as well as getting various other benefits, including ad-free listening and exclusive bonus members podcasts, do look into joining the Race Members Club. Click the link in the description to find out more, or alternatively, have a look on Patreon, search for the race, and you'll learn a bit more there. And don't forget our live show as well, January the 16th and the 17th in London and Birmingham. Loads of live chat looking ahead to the season. Should be very, very, very exciting. We're already looking forward to it.
The Athletic.